Good evening. First of all, my thanks to the American Academy for providing me with the chance to finally meet in person a prominent member of the Champions League of Film, Television and Media Studies, Ann Doane, who is now class of 1937 professor of film and media at the University of California since the recent years, after having been professor of modern culture and media at Brown University for many years before. As a temporal frame for the honor to introduce Ann Doane as academic figure and her research, Marie-Christine Mitzlaff granted me 5 to 7 minutes, which brings us right into a central issue of Ann Doane's cinematographical research, which is temporality, its technical affordances, slowing down motion or speeding it up, cutting it short. As expressed in her contribution, Has Time Become Space, in a book called Thinking Media Aesthetics, where she focuses on the point that a film trailer cuts short a film, skips a lot of otherwise remarkable details with a rhetorical figure of the ellipse, which, according to Oxford English Dictionary, is the omission of one or more words in a sentence which could be needed to complete the grammatical construction or fully to express the sense. So my function now is to function like a film trailer to your academic career, which is not an easy task. As an introducer, I now practically apply one of the time acts Ann Doane identified for cinema elliptically. I have to skip a lot of her many moments in writing an academic performance. For example, the many contributions to feminist studies in the formative years of that academic branch, which has now broadly succeeded, culminating in books like Femme Fatale on feminism within the context of film theory and psychoanalysis. Let me, as a kind of close-up, a term which will be among the subjects of her subsequent talk, concentrate on a few points. With her PhD on speech and dramatic art at the University of Iowa, a subject cultivated in 2000 years of the oldest time-based medium, which is theater, Ann Doane has been well prepared for a focus of research, which is the subject of one of her major books, from which I personally got inspired for years, which is called The Emergence of Cinematographic Time, 2002, dealing with central issues of cultural modernity, such as the experience of contingency and archival memory. Film culture knows the genre and concept of expanded cinema when the audience did not only experience sight on screen and sound from acousmatic off, but as well smell and even movement on their chairs, for example, to experience earthquakes in the story on screen. In a kind of epistemic equivalent, Ann Doane does expanded cinema studies, since with an impressive horizon of humanistic and theoretical knowledge, she embeds her case studies and topics within history of science, as well as contemporary philosophy. And that brought her actually close to German and especially Berlin academic culture for a long time already. Many of her writings have been translated in journals and collected books, and thereby Ann Doane contributed to the young, emerging discipline of so-called media studies. She has been fellow at the International Colleague for Research in Cultural Engineering and Media Philosophy at Weimar University, and the spirit of her research, which I call epistemologically biased, resonates actively with her research culture at so many institutions here in Berlin, such as even the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science. One of the nice aspects of the academic world is that even if not personally, I got the sense of having met Ann long years ago already, since the world of learning, since the time of humanism, afforded by the printing press allows to share thoughts by reading and writing. For me and many others in the young generation of German media studies, Ann Doane has been a formative reading, especially with her ongoing analysis of technological time as commodification of temporality with all its aesthetic, economic, cultural and philosophical consequences, for which a focal medium is filmmaking as well as television, the other major medium for her ongoing analysis. Let me mention as an example for Ann Doane's epistemological rather than simply mass media analysis, her transfer of René Thom's theory of catastrophe for explaining the character of breaking news in television. Her contribution to Patricia Mellencamp's book Logics of Television, called Information, Crisis, Catastrophe, from 1990, has become a classic in seminal readings to students of media and other studies and has been translated into German long ago. Ann Doane defines the significance of the electronic media event in its temporal immediacy, where the referent becomes indissociable from the medium, as she writes. This insight relates directly to recent German history, when, on November the 9th, 1989, the GDR speaker of the central government in East Berlin, Günter Schabowski, announced the word sofort, immediately, implementation of the new liberal travel license for East Germans. Since his word sofort, immediately, spoken at a press conference, was technically transmitted sofort, immediately, as a live signal by television and radio, it triggered the break of the Berlin Wall, since it was faster than any political or military administration could react to in real time. Such dramatic or even traumatic momentums are not exclusively restricted to historical incidences like recently 9/11 in television witnessing, things Ann Doane wrote about as well, but actually results from the microshocks in technology itself. And at that point, Ann Doane refers to Sigmund Freud and Walter Benjamin. In many recent studies on the effects of digital cinema, video and sound, the question is addressed whether such witnessing in its most technological level loses its indexicality. Until recently, radios and televisions, and nowadays mobile media, greatest technological process is its ability to be there, both on the scene and in your living room. Hence, Ann writes, the most catastrophic of technological catastrophes is the loss of the signal. In her following Anna Maria Kellen lecture, Ann Doane will deal with the close-up cinematic scale and the negotiation of space. And that will be complementary to her previous studies on cinematographic time and the archive historicizing impulse, as she has, for example, discussed with Hiroshi Sugimoto's classic long-time photographic exposures of the cinema screen when suddenly all the projected images merge into one bright light. An extreme condensation of time, as you write, a topic which she discusses with a broad technical and philosophical context, such as Henri Bergson's critique of cinematic and mathematical clock time, which samples duration, the true essence of time, into measurable spatial slices. To quote Ann Doane once more, Benjamin might say that the loss of aura associated with electric reproduction is a function of its inability to endure. That finally brings me to a media archaeological remark. Although cinema now looks like an old medium, Ann Doane updates cinema studies dramatically. Since behind the question of the geometrization of time, What is articulated is the message of digital culture itself, with its sampling techniques and mapping of time into topological storage and data processing. With her current book project, which Ann Doane will complete here at the American Academy, and with the subject of her talk tonight, we have the privilege of witnessing a dramatic shift of her major focus from time to space, thereby cinema analytically embracing the human conditions of perception in a dimension worth of Immanuel Kant. Ann Doane, for fall 2016 research topic, her research topic is headed Bigger Than Life. And indeed, we live a media culture where on the one hand, the minimalism of screens and loudspeakers in mobile phones, like its underlying microchips technology, is reduced to the max, while the cinema screen tends to expand enormously. Dear Ann Doane, your seminal writings already make you bigger than life in the academic world, and the more we are pleased to experience you tonight as life being and performance, and to quote the title of your tonight's talk, see you almost in close-up. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Wolfgang. That was really a wonderful introduction. And I was thinking, as you were talking about me being bigger than life, that term comes from a film with James Mason, in which bigger than life means that he's absolutely paranoid, actually. But I have to say, I'm at the outset that I'm very honored to be one of the Anna Maria Cullen Fellows at the Academy this fall. And I'm very grateful to the Academy for this time to research and write in this beautiful villa. There are really too many people to thank. The staff here at the Academy has been fabulous in attending to our every need and even anticipating those needs. And I really doubt that the friendliness, the collegiality, and the generosity of this class of fellows has been matched by any previous class, although I'm sure they all say that. But I'm very grateful to be here in this context with all of these people here. So let me begin. This paper is, it's a combination of the two emphases of the project overall. The first emphasis is the close-up as a type of shot that favors the face, as a type of shot that has been very important in the history of film theory. This was originally the topic of my project, but as this happens often, it expanded, and the scale became larger, and the second emphasis is really on very conceptualization of scale in cinema. The concept of scale itself in relation to both film shots, but also to screen size. And I don't deal in this particular talk very much with screen size, but I am doing that in another section of the book. And that is a very important thing for me, and particularly in light of the proliferation of screen sizes today. So, okay, I'm beginning with a quote from Robert Smithson, his essay entitled Cinematic Atopia. The sights in films are not to be located or trusted. All is out of proportion. Scale inflates or deflates into uneasy dimensions. We wander between the towering and the bottomless. We are lost between the abyss within us and the boundless horizons outside us. Any film wraps us in uncertainty. The history of film theory is inundated with speculation about the effects of various scales of shots, but by far the most heavily discussed scale is that of the close-up. Writing in the 1920s and 1930s, two film theorists in particular, Jean Epstein in France and Bela Balázs in Hungary and Germany, discussed the close-up in almost ecstatic and sometimes mystical terms, making it crucially specific to the cinema. Epstein often labored to produce a language that would be adequate to this experience. Witness, for instance, the linguistic contortions in his description of the close-up of a face breaking into a smile. I will never find the way to say how I love American close-ups. Point blank, a head suddenly appears on screen and drama, now face-to-face, seems to address me personally and swells with an extraordinary intensity. I am hypnotized. The orography of the face vacillates. Seismic shocks begin. Capillary wrinkles try to split the fault. A wave carries them away. Crescendo. A muscle bridles. The lip is laced with tics like a theater curtain. Everything is movement, imbalance, crisis. Crack. The mouth gives way like a ripe fruit splitting open. As if split by a scalpel, a keyboard-like smile cuts laterally into the corner of the lips, unquote. The description verges on the obscene, perhaps because it transforms the face, usually reserved as the very locus of subjectivity, into a harsh and alien object, a geographical site, a wave, a theater curtain, a piece of fruit, a keyboard. The excessiveness of Epstein's language is consistent with the inescapably hyperbolic nature of the close-up. The title of Epstein's article is Magnification. The intensifying properties of the close-up were linked by Epstein directly to its size, to its capacity for magnification. The privileged epistemological position of the face in close-up in Ballage's theory is signaled by its possession of its very own dimension, by its unique status in the realm of representation, by its flirtation, in fact, with the unrepresentable, but nevertheless knowable. Quote, the facial expression on a face is complete and comprehensible in itself, and therefore we need not think of it as existing in space and time, unquote. The close-up severs all relation with the establishing shot, of which it might at first appear to be merely a fragment. Ballage claims that even if we have seen in long shot the crowd of which this face is a part, the close-up effects a dramatic shift in significance. Quote, we would still feel that we have suddenly been left alone with this one face to the exclusion of the rest of the world. Facing an isolated face takes us out of space, unquote. Later in the 20th century, Gilles Deleuze would ally himself explicitly with Ballage, claiming that, quote, the close-up does not tear away its object from a set of which it would form part, of which it would be a part, but on the contrary, it abstracts it from all spatio-temporal coordinates. That is to say, it raises it to the state of entity, unquote. Of all the different types of shots, it is the close-up that is most fully associated with the screen as surface, with the annihilation of a sense of depth and its corresponding rules of perspectival realism. The image becomes once more an image rather than a threshold onto a world, or rather, the world is reduced to this face, this object. It is as though scale had gone awry. In comparison, the medium shot and the long shot appear to be of normal scale. For Sergei Eisenstein, who is usually associated in film theory primarily with montage, not single shots, tearing the object from the real, the close-up introduced, quote, absolute changes in the dimensions of bodies and objects on the screen, unquote. The ordinary laws or the ordinary rules of classical perspective no longer obtain. Quote, the laws of cinematographic perspective are such that a cockroach filmed in close-up appears on the screen 100 times more formidable than 100 elephants in medium long shot, unquote. Because the close-up exaggerates a perceived distortion of scale, then in fact characterizes any projected image of film, it has been the subject of a film theoretical obsession. The close-up always carries the threat of a certain monstrosity, a face or object filling the screen and annihilating all sense of scale. As Eisenstein and others have pointed out, the concept is inflected differently through its varying nomenclature in different languages. In Russian and in French, the term for close-up denotes largeness or large scale, for example, gros plan in French, while in English, it is nearness or proximity that is at stake. The close-up hence invokes two different binary oppositions, proximity versus distance, and the large versus the small. In the American context, it is conceptualized in terms of point of view, perspective, the relation between spectator and image, the spectator's place in the scene, assuming an identification between viewer and camera. In the Soviet and French context, it is thought as a quality of the image, as extensiveness, scale, and imposing stature, the awe of the gigantic as opposed to the charm of the miniature. In practice, cinema has always exploited the structuring ambiguity of shot size in the cinema, the ambiguity of scale versus distance. Despite the demand for life-size images of human beings in journalistic discourses about early cinema, and a certain anxiety about cutting up the body, very early films often played intensively with the relations, contradictions, and potential misreadings of the interplay between scale and distance. In Georges Méliès's 1901, The Man with a Rubber Head, a chemist, played by Méliès, produces a close-up within the diegesis by placing his own head on a table and then pumping it with air. And I'm going to show this short film, which I'm going to cut even shorter. So get rid of the setup. This is a pretty conventional way of ending an early film with some kind of catastrophe. Méliès generated the illusion by superimposing in the open space under an arch a view of his enlarging head, obtained by having the director roll on a trolley on an inclined plane toward the camera. The effect in the image is not that of a decreasing distance between the head and the camera or spectator position, but that of a head growing larger and larger as it is pumped with air. The precariousness and instability of such a perversion of magnitude, of bodily scale, is underlined by the catastrophic explosion. Méliès's play with scale, his ironic and hyperbolic exploitation of the larger-than-life quality of the cinema, is consistent with a more widespread interrogation of the aesthetic feasibility of the close-up in early cinema. Both in threatening a proper scale and in its dangerous proximity, the close-up poses the problem of the threshold, of the surface or screen as limit, as barrier. The specter of the close-up is raised whenever an object or person moves towards the camera, potentially putting into crisis the distance between screen and spectator. threatening to bridge the abyss of representation. Perhaps the most extreme of these early filmic ruminations on that threshold is The Big Swallow, aka Interviewee Swallows Camera, a film by the British filmmaker James A. Williamson in 1901. And I will also show this film.
The sales catalogue gives a description of this film, which clarifies the action.
I won't. I'll eat the camera first.
Gentleman reading finds a camera feed with his head under a cloth, focusing him up. He orders him off, approaching nearer and nearer, gesticulating and ordering him off until his head fills the picture. And finally, his mouth only occupies the screen.
The film dramatizes in raw form the implications of the extreme close-up, of occupying a space that is too proximate, a kind of no man's land of representation. For it is not only the cameraman who is incorporated, absorbed within the diegesis. The diegesis is a term that simply refers to narrative space, the space of the narrative, but the figure of the spectator as well, who succumbs, if only momentarily, to the enveloping nothingness of the screen. There is an ironic play here on the inextricability of proximity and size in relation to the camera. The gentleman has only to move closer to the camera to become large enough to swallow it. As Noel Birch has pointed out with respect to The Big Swallow, quote, "It is one of a series of battering rams beating on the invisible barrier that maintains the spectator in a state of externality," unquote. The close-up of early cinema seems more acutely to evoke the possibility of breaching the limit of the screen, the protective barrier of representation. In these examples, the problematic of scale and its distortion in cinema is performed. This distortion is not limited to the close-up, which is perhaps its best example, but is endemic to every shot size. With the rise of the classical Hollywood narrative and its continuity editing, the spectator was positioned to be less aware of the ambiguity. Preserving the unity and homogeneity of space, this style transmuted the perception of scale, that is, calling attention to the size of the screen, that of the image and aspect ratio, or the representational space, into the perception of distance within the diegesis, or represented space. This technique effects a displacement or amelioration of the threat of large scale, disproportion, and a disturbing monumentality by translating scale, the logic of large and small, into distance, closer or further. The word and the concept of scale, however, have many different meanings. In geometry, scale is a relatively straightforward concept linked to proportion. Scale refers to the relation between the representation of an object or a territory on a map and the object itself. In the Oxford English Dictionary, scale is, quote, "a system of representing or reproducing objects in a smaller or larger size proportionally in every part. To scale with exactly proportional representation of each part of the model," unquote. But the term can also refer to a range of exposures or colors in photography, or of notes in music. Scale is in addition a standard of measure or calculation, as on a world scale or the scale of the catastrophe. In the plural, it can be an attribute of the body, scales, this is again the OED, quote, "membranous or horny outgrowths or modifications of the skin in many fishes and reptiles and some mammals," unquote. or as a disease, one of the layers of the epidermis which can become separated. In another somewhat remote sense, scales can be a cause of blindness or lack of knowledge. To remove the scales from one's eyes means to become enlightened and binds knowledge to the visible. Scale is also a measure of weight, as in the scales of justice, although here the judge is blindfolded, one of the most potent symbols of democracies. While scale might be assumed to be an extremely stable concept within the discipline of geography, in recent years there have been raging debates about the concept of scale in human geography, cultural geography, and radical geography. The project of geographers has aimed at the de-ontologization of scale and its understanding as a social and hence variable construction. Although there is widespread acceptance of a methodological division between the local, the urban, the regional, the nation-state, and the global, the relations between these scales, and sometimes the usefulness of the divisions themselves, is subject to great dispute. Are these relations nesting, hierarchical, dialectical? Andrew Kirby echoes David Harvey in claiming that globalization is a concept displacing the more politically charged concepts of imperialism and neo-colonialism. Marxist radical geographers tend to see capitalism as the driver of scale, and through accumulation fostering a greater and greater expansion. Feminist geographers often claim that the emphasis upon production has suppressed an understanding of the scale of realms of reproduction and the domestic usually associated with women. Taken further, this position claims that the global over local hierarchy, quote, underwrites the problematic view that social processes can be detached from the grounded sites where people and objects concretely reside and social practices take place, for example, in streets, bedrooms, and boardrooms, unquote. Larger scales, the nation-state, the global, in their absolute abstraction, according to this argument, should be dismissed in favor of human experiential scales. However, this in turn poses a number of problems linked to its polarization of the abstract and the concrete, assuming, for instance, that nationalism or globalization are not lived or do not have very real effects, and that the experiential is not infused with abstraction. But this is a recurring problem in discourses about scale that almost always calibrate themselves in relation to a particular conceptualization of the human. In Robert Taverner's vast intellectual history of the various systems of measurement devised by culture over the last 2 millennia, entitled Smoot's Ear, The Measure of Humanity, the practice of calculating size in relation to the human body as ultimate standard, the foot, the cubit, is displaced historically by the search for a universal system ultimately based on the abstract and dehumanized, if not anti-human for him, meter. For Taverner, this development constitutes a great loss, a denial of human experience or human scale, both determined by the body. Hence, the narrative of Oliver R. Smoot acts as not simply an amusing anecdote, but as a hyperbolic confirmation of Taverner's call for a greater humanization of scale. Smoot, the shortest initiate in a fraternity at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1958, was chosen as the subject and tool of a prank revolving around measurement. The initiates, or pledges, were given the task of measuring the length of the Harvard Bridge using Smoot's height as the determinant unit. He was 5 feet 7 inches. They found that the bridge was 364.4 smoots, plus or minus 1 ear. And this is Smoot as a measure, and his ear as the variable. For Taverner, here the body is quite literally used as a form of measurement. For Taverner, Smoot's ear represents the leftover, the plus or minus, the inevitable impossibility of truly accurate measurement, and hence the confirmation of the persistence of the human, here defined as the fallible, in all measuring systems. In addition, the humor of the prank hinges on the knowledge that Smoot's height has no generalizability, but is one of the specific features of individuality, given the very large range of human sizes. The MIT prank is an ironic conflation of the scientistic and the humanistic. And yet scale is associated with the corporeal in another way, as the flakes or laminates of skin that can be peeled away as traces of the body, lost to the body, a pathological phenomenon. In this sense, scale is entangled with a vision of mechanical reproduction as a peeling off and circulation of the forms or skins of bodies or objects. In the June 1859 issue of the Atlantic Monthly, Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote that photography, and specifically stereography, divorced form from matter and hence deprived matter of the value of its visuality. Quote, "There is only one Colosseum or Pantheon, but how many millions of potential negatives have they shed, representatives of billions of pictures since they were erected? Every conceivable object of nature and art will soon scale off its surface for us. Men will hunt all curious, beautiful, grand objects as they hunt the cattle in South America for their skins and leave the carcasses as of little worth," unquote. Holmes was concerned with the impact of this for the archive, how to store and make accessible the resulting huge number of scales or skins of objects. But the detachability of these forms in photography and their later projection in the cinema also dissolved any concept of scale that could be soldered to the spectator's body, occasioning an anxiety that manifested itself in the early cinema as a demand for life-size images and grandeur naturelle in early press commentary on moving pictures. The close-up in particular was perceived as aesthetically offensive in extreme ways, as monstrous or grotesque, even castrating, an excessive display of disproportion in scale and a violence to the human body. The residue of this hysteria can be seen in the hyperbolic language of early film theorists such as Epstein and Balazs. The continuing and compensatory effects of this anxiety about representation and scale can still be seen in the concept of actual size or actual scale, often used in advertising photographs. Now, this isn't an advertisement, but it's one of the few references to actual size I could find on the web, for good reasons, I think. Now, this is an attempt to disprove the claim for actual size of a pill by putting the actual pill next to the actual size pill. Actual scale is a paradox insofar as it is an attempt to annihilate representation, to authenticate the image by denying its scalelessness. Yet it is an admission of the scalar instabilities of visual representation. For like television and liveness, where the graphic live is required to authenticate the temporality of the image, one always has to be told with a caption that this is the actual scale of an object. There is an exception whose exceptionality is a function of its indexicality, its physical adherence to its object. The nature print, a physical imprint of a plant specimen, which Jeremy Blatter has named the 0 degree of scale. However, as he points out, this scalar fidelity sacrifices other attributes of the object, including its three-dimensionality. The cinema, even in films like Man Ray's rayograms, in which pens and nails are scattered across the surface of the celluloid to exploit their direct imprint, has no access to the 0 degree of scale because the images are projected on a screen and hence enlarged, unpredictably given the variation in theatrical throws. The concept of actual size, or the 0 degree of scale, is hyperbolized and ironized in Borges' famous short essay of Exactitude in Science. Jean Baudrillard's well-known reading of this essay emphasizes the ludic nature of a map the size of the territory it maps, and deploys Borges' essay to shed light on his own concept of simulation and the destruction of the real. But what is lost in his reading is Borges' ironic critique of science and his invention of a mythical cartography as an absurd instantiation of scientific exactitude. In that empire, the craft of cartography attained such perfection that the map of a single province covered the space of an entire city, and the map of the empire itself an entire province. In the course of time, these extensive maps were found somehow wanting, and so the College of Cartographers evolved a map of the empire that was of the same scale as the empire, and that coincided with it point for point. Less attentive to the study of cartography, succeeding generations came to judge a map of such magnitude cumbersome. And not without irreverence, they abandoned it to the rigors of sun and rain. In the western deserts, tattered fragments of the map are still to be found, sheltering an occasional beast or beggar. In the whole nation, no other relic is left of the discipline of geography. Of Exactitude in Science appears in a collection of Borges' short essays titled A Universal History of Infamy, and takes the form of a literary forgery attributed to a fictional J.A. Suarez Miranda and allegedly written centuries ago. The appeal to historicity is redoubled by the inconsistent use of capital letters as signs of an aged and historical writing. The historical loss emerges as that of the discipline of geography, whose tool, cartography, has evolved from a craft to a college, study, and finally a discipline. Why do we find this characterization of cartography and the ideal map so absurd, so ludicrous? Maps are supposed to be utilitarian, and their utility hinges upon their reduced scale and hence portability. A map usually carries within it its own explanation or illustration of the scale it uses. For example, 1 inch equals 5 miles. But here, the perfection of cartography entails its own annihilation, the erasure of proportion as an instrument of representation, the very rejection of representation so that the map merges with its territory. Scientific exactitude avoids the possibility of inaccuracy by invoking a scale of 1 to 1, or point for point. Nostalgia for the discipline of geography is here nostalgia for the scale of the real. The cinema is the antithesis of this Borgesian perfect cartography. The cinema in its earliest years had barely started to generate a hysteria about scale deviating from the scale of the human body when it began to exploit the scalar instabilities of the projected image through the use of the scale model, one of the first special effects. In 1898, E.H. Lumet used miniature ships and a tank to film Battle of Santiago Bay. And Fred Dobson used a scale model of San Francisco burning in order to film the earthquake of 1906. Here you see him dousing the fire. The use of the scale model takes advantage of the illegibility of scale in the cinema, the spectator's inability to locate herself spatially in relation to the image. The comparability required to acquire a sense of scale resides only within the image, where perspective and distance can be manufactured independently of any real space. And here are some more contemporary examples. Okay, Luc Besson in The Fifth Element with the scale model. And here is a shot from that film. Robert Smithson's sense of dislocation in the cinema, of proportion out of control, leads him to label the cinema an atopia, no place. The scale model depends upon and instantiates what could be seen as two not unrelated failures of the classical theatrical cinema. First, the inability of the spectator to orient herself or to measure scale in relation to her own body, thus producing a fundamental dislocation. Second, the failure of the cinema to provide the precision and control of a scientific instrument due to its scalar instability, both spatially and temporally. This was Jules Etienne Maret's reason for dismissing film as a viable tool of scientific method. There is a sense in which cinema exposes the impossibilities of scale as it has been conceived in relation to both the realm of the human and the realm of abstract science. In the European film industry in the mid-1920s, Eugen Schuften invented a process using mirrors to generate illusory scales that came to be known as the Schuften process. As Katharina Loh has argued, the Schuften process standardized and commodified the bricoleur-like production of special effects that had previously been associated with art and handicraft in relation to singular filmic challenges that demanded varying approaches, like the boats in the bathtub. The Schuften process was economical, allowing the extensive use of small-scale models in place of large, expensive sets. And this is an example of how it works. In this process, a mirror, part of whose reflective surface has been removed so that it's transparent in that place, is placed at a 45-degree angle in front of the camera. And the small-scale model, which is this here, is situated to the side of the camera. The live action of the scene appears in the non-reflective part of the mirror, seemingly surrounded by the environment provided by the model reflected in the mirror. So this is the result. This is actually a shot from Fritz Lang's Metropolis. The Schuften process was used in two of Fritz Lang's films, Die Nibelungen, Siegfried of 1924 and Metropolis of 1927. And here's another example of its use in the film Metropolis. This section here is the live action, and the rest is the scale model. As Loh points out, the Schuften process was associated with Gulliver effects, i.e., quote, the rendition of extreme size differences between living things, unquote. Special effects in this case are based on the meticulous confusion of virtual and real images in order to produce effects of scale. The use of scale models contributes to the growing dissociation of scale and the human body, here the body of the spectator as measure. The critique of the abstract metric scale in evidence in Taverner's work was shared by Le Corbusier, who conceived of architecture first and foremost as a space designed for the human body, one which humans must inhabit, and therefore one whose proportions must accommodate that body. In the 1942 treatise, The Modular, he embraced units of measure based on parts of the human body: elbow, the cubit, finger, digit, thumb, inch, foot, pace, etc., and disdained the move to the metric system, which was abstract and, quote, indifferent to the stature of man, unquote. These organic units were superior to the metric units because, quote, they formed an integral part of the human body, and for that reason they were fit to serve as measures for the huts, the houses, and the temples that had to be built. More than that, they were infinitely rich and subtle because they formed part of the mathematics of the human body, gracious, elegant, and firm, the source of that harmony which moves us, unquote. Despite the nostalgia for man, not woman, of course, as the measure of all things, the anthropometric system was not unproblematic. As Christopher Lukenbiel has argued, quote, anthropometric measures are attributes of power and class struggle. They are symbolic and built on a process of social conditions in which the idea of just measures becomes a symbol of just man, of justice as such, and of just human relations, unquote. Hence the scales in the figure of a blind justice. While the development of the metric system was allegedly an attempt to produce and enforce a universal mode of measurement grounded in scientific principles, it simply incarnated a shift from the human body as regulator of scale to a globe that had become ever more definitive of experience, whose symbolic pressure was increasingly felt. In the late 18th century, well into the era of colonialism, there were two schools of thought about the definition of a standard unit of measurement, one based on the duration of the swing of a pendulum, ultimately rejected due to perturbations caused by gravity, and the other advocating the definition of the meter as 1/10,000,000th of the length of the distance from the equator to the North Pole. The approach based on the measurement of the circumference of the Earth was the historical victor, at least temporarily. In 1889, the First General Conference of Weights and Measures established an international prototype meter bar, which is still housed in Sèvres, France. That's actually, this is the altar of the meter. Its original ground of authority was the measurement of the globe, an enterprise that was increasingly perceived as problematic since the Earth is not a perfect sphere. The globe, according to Peter Sloterdijk, has constituted the imaginary image of location at least from the time of the circumnavigation of the world in the 16th century, and is hence a product of the colonial enterprise. Quote, discovery aims for acquisition. This gave cartography its world historical function. Maps are the universal instrument for securing what has been discovered, insofar as it is meant to be recorded on the globe and given as secure find, unquote. Contemporary discourses of globalization as a new phenomenon are blind to the fact that the concept of space in relation to a world conceived as a sphere and hence as conquerable are effectively much older than these discourses admit. The apprehension of the world as a globe coincided with the concept of discovery and control of new territory with colonialist and imperialist discourses. From the outset, globalization presupposed that any point on the globe was equidistant from the center, and hence, in terms of measurement at any rate, equivalent to any other location. A homogenization of space that continued to accelerate into the 20th century and beyond. The cinema participated in this early discourse of globalization in a number of different ways. It is not coincidental that the prototype meter bar came to incarnate a universal measurement at the same time that the cinema emerged with the claim that it was a universal language, readable across national and linguistic borders. But in addition, the cinema was an arena for a certain play with scale, an alignment of scales of shots that produced an imaginary space in which the idea of the spectator's location was repressed and reconfigured. The iconography of cinema often colluded with this discourse on scale and its malleability. Scale models go hand in hand with tales of enormous scalar disproportion between monsters and human beings. Monsters whose spectacular size is often a result of world disaster, of atomic catastrophe, whose effects are perceived in relation to seemingly unimaginable sizes, both small and large. Mothra, in the 1961 film of that title produced by Toho Studios, is a gigantic egg, then caterpillar, then moth, whose disproportion is directly linked to atomic testing on the island where she resides. And this is an example of Mothra in her larvae stage. And these monsters always wreak havoc on the built environment, the human built environment. This is a poster. And there you have a behind-the-scenes shot of Mothra. Now she is a moth. And in this shot, you can't tell anything about scale, right? It could be, a shot of a butterfly or something, except that it's very unreal. But it's cut. There's a cut immediately to this shot, which is the effect of Mothra's wings, the wind that affects the ships. The island where Mothra was discovered, or from whence she came, in general is inhabited by fantastic forms of both plants and animals, and two women, only 12 inches tall, who act as Mothra's priestesses and are able to summon her after they are captured to be put on display, a bit like King Kong. These are the miniature women. As miniatures, they are carnival-like attractions who prove to be the fascinating scalar counterpart of the enormous Mothra. Godzilla, in the original film of that name, directed by Ishiro Honda in 1954, is both a metaphor for and a product of nuclear holocaust. In his immensity and unstoppability, Godzilla is the atomic bomb itself. Honda, the director, said years after the film, quote, "I wanted to make radiation visible," unquote. For the threat of the atom bomb lies not so much in its materiality or even tremendous energy, but in the devastation of its lasting effects. A prominent paleontologist in the film inspects a giant radioactive footprint and hypothesizes that Godzilla is a creature from the Jurassic Age whose dormancy was broken by American testing of the H-bomb. Godzilla breathes radioactive fire. Giganticism of this genre, including Godzilla, Mothra, and King Kong, is accompanied by a number of tropes. The utter destruction of urban architecture, bridges, skyscrapers, etc., the ineffectivity of armies, missile systems, or any known defensive weapons in battling the monster, the awakening of a contained monster, often associated with a primitive culture, and the resulting havoc it wreaks upon civilized societies. The tropes of discovery and conquest are pervasive. King Kong is discovered by a film crew and stolen from his primitive and even prehistoric surroundings in order to be put on display in New York. The Empire State Building, because its scale is widely known, can ironically act as the measure of both empire and its conquest, King Kong. So this is a fairly famous shot of Fay Ray in the hand of King Kong on top of the Empire State Building. These pathologies of scale accompany the aggressive incursion or penetration into new spaces on the globe. The proof of this exploration of the new, other, alien is the creature whose scale is unimaginable, inhuman. For Sloterdijk, the globe became, quote, the central medium of the new homogenizing approach to location, unquote, and its, quote, monopoly on complete views of the Earth's surface was only broken late in the 20th century by satellite photography. A sense of the world as globe ruptured the experience of location as potentially separate, isolated, and protected. No place was immune from the knowledge that there was more outside, that one is caught within a global network. Location for Sloterdijk is, quote, not a blind spot in a field, but rather a place in which one sees that one is seen, unquote, as a consequence of globalization. In this sense, cinema is compensatory, for in the theater, the spectator sees that she is not seen. The credibility of the film space depends upon it. The delocalization of the spectator, not necessarily her disembodiment, is the precondition for the intense production of location that is a crucial component of cinema. It is strange that film theory historically has not been more attentive to scale as a concept. It is a crucial component of the cinema's representation of space in a quite specific way that cannot be duplicated in theater or literature, the usual arts invoked in early discussions of cinematic specificity. While the scale model is perhaps the most overt and obvious incarnation of the cinema's ability to exploit the illegibility of scale, that tendency can be seen in the less ostentatious realms of the scale of shots, close-up, medium shot, long shot, the aspect ratio and scale of the screen, perspectival relations, and the very fact of projection. A small frame becomes a dauntingly large projected image. The management of scale in the cinema is a fundamental aspect of its production of a space that resides nowhere else but in the cinema, hence its characterization as atopia, a space that could perhaps be characterized as both unreadable and overly readable, illusorily navigable and fundamentally disorienting. Today, the gigantic screens of IMAX theaters work to reconfirm the possibility of absorption into a manufactured space, which has played such an important role in the history of cinema. In other words, it seems necessary today to exaggerate, to hyperbolize the cinema in order to be assured that it works. Yet the possibility of its failure is also allayed by the proliferation of miniature screens, so that it could be said that the screen is not simply enormous, it is everywhere. The inevitable limit to its magnitude is compensated for by its proliferation. Focusing on the close-up, early film theory elaborated the way in which detail and enormity, miniature and gigantic, are inextricable in the cinema. It is the cinema understood in this way which laid the groundwork for a future cultural logic of the screen. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this, if you like, presenting us with a frame of reference for any discussion of space, place, perspective, possibly size and scale. And I now invite you to ask questions. And we have a tradition here at the American Academy to ask short, brief, precise, intelligent, snappy questions. No statements, please. Who's first? Sorry, I didn't mean to intimidate you in any way. Now, Marianne, while we are standing here...
You're going to ask me a snappy
Does your theory
Intelligent.
apply to narrative as well? I was wondering about this, because when you talk about a frame of reference and perspective and scale in the true sense of the word, imagine the beginning of a novel, for instance, where the author concentrates on the face of the protagonist. Would that be the same thing that we see in the films that you presented? Because there's no external frame of reference and it's in the mind, if you like, of the beholder, of the reader. Is there a narrative element in what you just described?
Well, it's always difficult to talk about the status of an image in literature versus the status of an image in the cinema. And I tend to see it as a very different type of example, primarily because in the theater, in a narrative film, when you're faced with a close-up of a face, it has to do, with the size, the visual, image itself. And it also is linked very much to its relation to other shots as well. So I don't think, the thing about scale is that since literature is not primarily a visual medium, it seems to me that its effects of scale are really quite different than those in the cinema.
Thank you. There's a question.
You have to be very short. What about the audio scale? Sorry.
That was brief.
Yes, that's a very good question. There is such a thing as a sound close-up, of course. I think what I can say right now is that I have another paper that I'm going to give later in the semester at the ICI. You should come and hear it, because it's on sound. It isn't actually on the sound close-up, but it is on the way that sound is used to activate the space of the auditorium, particularly in new immersion systems, sound surround systems, because that's one of the things I'm very interested in is the scale of the screen, the scale of the sound in relation to that, but also the localizability of the sound in relation to the image. And the proliferation of speakers in the theater really changes that tremendously, at the same time that very much more than you would think remains the same, actually.
Yes, please.
Okay. Fascinating talk. I wanted to relate to the sense of disorientation that we have with the single image, but think about the cinema in terms of, yes, usually a progression and a succession of images, and thinking how narrative then creates a sense of space, actually the diegesis as a sense of space by giving us proportion only through the succession of images or the seriality of images where we can relate them and,
Yes.
get a way of inhabiting a space that's otherwise.
Yes, yes. I mean, that's really one of the primary issues. And it's why I think it's very interesting that writers like Epstein and Balázs wanted so badly to dissociate the close-up from the rest of the space of the film, despite, all of the evidence that in the actual viewing of the film, it was inseparable. And so their concentration on this despatialization, what they call the despatialization of the close-up, particularly the close-up of the face, was part of their cinephilia, in a way, to demonstrate that there's a kind of superiority in the cinema, that this vision is a new, clear, pure vision. And in a way, it sort of snatches it out of the temporal flow. But as you can see, and even in the example from Mothra, the sense of Mothra's size is a function of the devastation she wreaks in the next shot, and it's not in the shot itself. So scale can't really, it's very difficult to talk about scale in a single image, in a sense. You can only talk about it in relation to the spectator. And I think this is why Epstein and Balázs really liked that idea, that it was despatializing, because it actually invoked a kind of work on the part of the spectator, a work of reading, a work of, celebrating the face, etc. And that it in a sense, had to stop the flow of the film. Scale is only, you're absolutely right, it's produced, there are ways of talking about the close-up as an isolated shot, but then again, it's part of a larger film. And usually that film, not always, but in the instances that I'm working with here, is narrative. So the scale is developed through comparability within the diegesis of the film. But what I'm trying to argue is that you, as the spectator, don't have access to that. In other words, you cannot possibly measure the scale in any other way, except by accepting the validity of this world, of this space that's given to you.
Question here. Chance.
Thank you very much, Marianne. With the exception of King Kong, which is a product of the 30s, most of the giant monster films of my youth that I love so much seem to belong to a particular moment in history, the mid-50s, so things like Them and the Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, if you can consider that a giant monster, or Earth versus the Giant Spider, things like those, all seem to have come from the mid-50s. Can you explain why there was this vogue at the time? I understand Godzilla was around the same time. Was it due to some sort of technological advance, or was it because of the threat of nuclear war? Was it some aspect of all these three things? It's something that's always bothered me.
Well, I think it's overdetermined. I don't think there's one cause. And I certainly do think that the post-war situation and the threat, the atomic threat, the threat of nuclear war plays into that. I also think that there are remnants or the residue of colonialism, because usually these monsters are associated with the other. I don't really think it has directly to do with any technological advances. Well, one of the surprising things about looking at these movies now, but even then, was how unreal they are, right? King Kong or Godzilla. Now that's changed recently. With CGI, et cetera. But the acceptability of the films really had to do with size, I think, with magnitude, and with the kind of thinking about otherness and about nuclear catastrophe in relation to magnitude.
Please.
Yeah, thanks very much for giving us these wonderful examples of a spectator response. I'd like to ask about the other possibilities of the viewer's response, because it seems to me that nowadays these large-scale close-ups are not just used for creating a feeling of threat and danger, but also very much intimacy. What about these close-ups? They invade the intimate space, the personal space of a being, and that's also a reaction that's elicited, isn't it?
Yes, I think so, definitely. But it's a different aspect of the close-up. And I think it has to do with the question of interiority. It's not only sort of, closeness is actually a misreading, right? It's already metaphoric, because you aren't any closer to the person. The person's larger. and so, you know, the French and the Russians are right, and the Americans are wrong about that. It isn't closer. It's a particular reading of the close-up. But a lot of people do see it as intimacy. And in fact, Jean Epstein has many, you know, essays where he talks about closeness and intimacy, but he still really writes in a way that sort of sucks the humanity or the humanness out of the figure. He's interested more in the sort of a technological capacity of the cinema, which he calls photogenie. Intimacy is, as I say, it's a construct, but it is used in narratives. But I think even more importantly is the idea of interiority. The idea that you can see a face and you can read it and know what the person is thinking, feeling, etc. Has to do with acting, but it also has to do with a sense of the universal legibility of the face, which is a very problematic concept, but one which has accompanied the cinema from, you know, almost from the get-go. So I think that I would want to talk about intimacy. I mean, it's certainly a narrative device, it's a tactic, it's a strategy, but it's also a metaphorical discourse, and so is the discourse about interiority as well. It's something that is used by the cinema, but the cinema is about surfaces. So there's a labor there to produce the idea of interiority.
Somebody right behind you, Tina.
Yeah, that makes me think of a wonderful formulation by an architect. It takes a willing subject to see certain things which may not be there. And with this, I want to link the question. You talked about the multiplication of screens and their sizes, which is also has its consequences for scale. So I wonder how spectators can react to the close-up when they look at film on a small screen. I mean, would film change its strategies because of that?
Well, it depends on, you know, modes of exhibition, right? Was the film made to be seen on an iPhone, for instance? Not many are. But it's entirely possible, and it's, I don't, you know, I think it's all relative, to tell you the truth. When I watch movies on an airplane on my laptop, I'm so close to the screen that I feel like the experience is kind of similar in terms of scalar properties to watching it in a cinema, where I'm, you know, much further away from the image. The image is correspondingly smaller. But I think it's a very interesting phenomenon, because in the cinema, the scale of the screen, or certainly the aspect ratio of the screen, remained so standardized for so long. And then with the advent of widescreen in the 50s, which people will often argue was a response to television, the smaller television screen, this is something the television can't do that the cinema can do. And then with IMAX and the enlarging of the screen experience, which could be seen as a reaction to the digital or to the proliferation of other kinds of screens, or the enlarging of the television screen, and then the small screens as well. So I tend to see that phenomenon in different terms than the ones I've laid out here. I see it, and it's one I'm very concerned with and interested in the project, just not in this particular section of it. I tend to see that as a kind of scalar expansion in relation to a network, a horizontal expansion, and not the kind of, not the question of the scale of the close-up or whatever, but has to do with the establishment of your location in relation to a network of other people. And similarly, a kind of imaginary geography that goes along with that.
Yes, right here.
Thank you very much for this wonderful lecture. I was curious about the historical relations between the manipulation of scale in early cinema and the use of collage by historical avant-gardes in visual arts like Dadaist and so on. So there's all objects are out of scale to each other, and that's the point of a collage. So I was wondering if there are historical connections between, let's say, the Schuften process and the Dadaists, or are they exploring similar things too independently from each other? And the second, perhaps, a similar question is, what do you think of the status of the 3D movies in terms of the disappearance of the distance between the screen and the audience?
I didn't hear
the 3D films. I mean, there is also a disappearance between the disappearance of the distance between the screen and the audience. I mean, many people comment on the 3D movies as a money-making thing, but would you say that it is in the logic of the manipulation of scale? It's like the swallowing man that you showed. What do you think of this fascination with 3D movies these days?
Okay, the first question about the avant-garde and collage and the Schuften process, I wouldn't see the heritage of the Schuften process in the avant-garde. I would see it instead in actually magic, which was an important predecessor to the cinema in any event, but going back as far as the phantasmagoria and the magic lanterns, etc., the phantasmagoria did use mirrors, in effect. So I think that there's, if there's any lineage or, influence, it would be there rather than in the avant-garde. Certainly not, I can't see it in relation to collage necessarily, because it requires, I don't know, do you think collage is a trick of the eye? Is it,
No, everything is out of scale, and that's the point. The manipulation of scale is very much the idea of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it may be, but I haven't seen it, any kind of effect that I could, trace. But I do think, I cut a section here that was on the phantasmagoria, which is very much about producing horror and anxiety through manipulations of, the magnitude of objects and ghosts, etc. The second question was about 3D, and I think that 3D is part of a larger phenomenon, which would include both IMAX. Oftentimes 3D and IMAX are together. Also sound surround. And it seems to be an attempt to actually destroy the frame of the film so that it becomes an environment that you inhabit. So there's a discourse of immersion that accompanies 3D, IMAX, sound surround, etc. It's a journalistic discourse. It's a discourse of advertising as well. You become immersed in this world. And I think it's a kind of exacerbation of what I'm talking about here, in the sense that even when you watch a regular classical film, you are delocalized. The idea is to sort of reduce your sense of locality, location, etc., your sense of being able to judge space and to negotiate and to situate yourself in relation to space. And instead, it provides you with other worlds, other spaces, so that you are other than where you are. And I think that's a phenomenon. You could talk about virtual reality also in relation to that, where the screen is pretty much eliminated.
I think we have time for one more question. There is somebody in the back.
So I just wanted to ask about another discourse about close-ups from Hugo Münsterberg, who describes the close-up as the simulation of human attention. So you describe close-ups in terms of proximity, distance, and the distortion of representations to produce an effect with respect to the viewer's understanding of the size of the objects. Münsterberg describes it as being our attention made into a technical device for defining the objects. And I wonder if there's, I don't know, a historical or conceptual relationship between this interplay between objects and audience.
Well, Münsterberg, of course, was trying to apply experimental psychology to the cinema in order to understand the aesthetics of the cinema. And for Münsterberg, attention, the close-up was about attention. It was a sort of, as you said, a technological transformation of the human ability to attend to something, you know, to have attention to an object. But even in closely reading his work, I've been trying to construct a history of film theory's relation to the close-up. And I don't think, there are many ways in which he's very close to Epstein and Balázs. When he talks about attention, for him, attention affects the fading away or disappearance of the surroundings, the complete disappearance. And he compares it to theater, of course. In theater, you know, the playwright can call attention to something in the scene, but the playwright cannot sort of completely void the space of the stage itself, and film can do that. So in a sense, he is arguing something very similar to Epstein and Balázs, which has to do with a kind of D Spatialization that the close-up effects. For him, it's a different kind of mechanism, certainly than Epstein, but there are curious resonances there, I think.
Thank you very much for not only your inspiring talk, but for answering questions in such a way that we get more food for thought and ideas and concepts resonate, and we all are invited now to the next room to continue our discussions and debate about scale and close-ups of drinks and food, probably, and to engage in a conversation with whoever is next to you about the aesthetics of film and modern media, because that's something that's around us. And I thank you very much on behalf of the American Academy for giving this talk tonight. Thank you, Mary and John.